Between chapters 1 and 2 of Esther, there are wider geopolitical events playing out, with huge ramifications for the known world. In between these two chapters, Xerxes assembles a massive army and invades Greece in 480 BC. The legendary short battle of Thermopylae occurs during this campaign against the Spartan king Leonidas. But far more catastrophic for Xerxes, a massive storm, combined with expert Grecian navy manoeuvring, sees him lose many ships and men at sea. Ultimately, his campaign to conquer Greece fails, and a significant portion of his retreating army dies of starvation, exposure, and disease in a long retreat back to Persia. This failed military campaign is not mentioned in the Bible narrative. Unsurprisingly, given the narrative appears to have been written at a time of Persian censorship, the writer of Esther chooses their words very carefully. Let's read from Esther chapter 2, verse 1. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Several years have passed since he dismissed his wife Vashti. The indication of these words are that Xerxes misses his wife, but a decree had been made against her, which even he is unable to overturn. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Susa, the citadel, into the women's quarters, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This thing pleased the king. What a surprise. And he did so. In an attempt to perhaps lift Xerxes' spirits after his failed Grecian campaign, his attendants suggest a kingdom-wide beauty contest to find a new queen. Again, we have another group of advisors directing the agenda of this king. For the record, this beauty contest was not the sort of thing that young women were lining up to take part in. This was no Miss Universe contest. The satraps and nobles just took the most beautiful young virgins from throughout the kingdom. Of course, it would be an honour for any regional satrap to have the king favour one of his maidens as the next queen, so you can see their motives. Verse 5, in Susa, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured, with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. At this point, we're introduced to Mordecai, a Jew who was a son of Kish from the tribe of Benjamin. Jews didn't talk about grandsons, great-grandsons, etc. like we do. If you had a noteworthy forefather, you'd call yourself a son of that person. Mordecai was a son of Kish. He was a son of Benjamin. He was a son of Jacob. He was a son of Abraham. Many Bible scholars have questioned Mordecai's faith. Their argument is God had wanted his people to return to the land of promise years earlier. Only a tiny remnant had returned about 5 decades beforehand. So the fact that Mordecai was in Persia is proof to them that he was living outside the will of God. This is an interpretation which may turn out to be very unfair to Mordecai. No doubt some Jews remained in Persia because they'd become comfortable and didn't want to migrate to the land of their forefathers and start their lives again. Yet we have to allow for the possibility that most Jews were not free to go back to the land of Israel as they pleased. Living in a free society, as we do, we sometimes forget our freedoms are a privilege many people throughout history did not enjoy. Remember, the Jews were a conquered people and were not free as we are. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. She was an orphan. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So by our definitions, Mordecai and Esther are cousins. But in reality, Mordecai adopts Esther and brings her up as his own daughter. Esther is her Persian name. Hadassah is her birth or Hebrew name. In the context of the history, it appears she takes on her Persian name to hide her Hebrew heritage. It seems that Esther's Persian name is a code. In most Bible commentaries, you'll rightly have noted that Esther means star, and to the Persians, Esther did mean star. But in Hebrew, the root of Esther is Hester, which means hidden or concealed. One of the main themes of the book of Esther appears to be how God works behind the scenes, hidden, concealed. This book records no miracles or direct interventions of God at all. God will ultimately save his people due to the faith and courage of Esther and Mordecai being willing to walk his pathway. Whilst they act in faith, God's unseen or hidden hand is conducting the events to bring about a righteous conclusion. Mordecai's name, for the record, means warrior, and we'll certainly find out he wasn't a man who would bow down to others. So it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Susa, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace, into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. Please notice that Esther is taken. This thing happened to her. She didn't choose to go, nor was it that she was allowed to go by Mordecai, nor did Mordecai willingly give her up. She was taken. There's no indication Esther was a willing participant in this event. By all accounts, Esther was extraordinarily beautiful, breathtaking in fact, a fact that had not escaped the attention of people in high places. Now the young woman pleased him. The him is Haggai, and she obtained his favour. So he readily gave beauty preparations to her besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants. There's that number again. It wasn't just the Jews who were focused and fond of the number 7. 7 servants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. This so much reminds me of the story of Joseph. Wherever Joseph was, whether a son, slave, or a prisoner, he always found favour and rose to the top due to the providence of God. Although God is not mentioned in this story, it's virtually guaranteed Esther was a great woman of God, and God blesses her because of this. Just like Joseph, Esther rises to the top. She becomes Haggai's favourite. There were many beautiful women throughout Persia, but what made Esther stand above them all was that she was beautiful in nature. And I believe, like Joseph, she had a heart for God's will. You really have to read between the lines in the account of Esther. You need to dig beneath the surface. Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. We see in Mordecai's behaviour his obvious love and concern for his adopted daughter. Esther's hiding of her Jewishness causes some to question her faith. However, Mordecai was very wise to direct Esther to keep her heritage hidden. As being a Jew in many places and at many times was and still is an extremely dangerous thing to admit. She probably wouldn't have won the favour of either Haggai or Xerxes if she was openly Jewish. This is not an excuse for us today to hide our Christianity. Being a Christian in the West is a very different thing to being a Jew in the Middle East, either now or then. Esther hiding her heritage is part of the concealed, hidden plans of God playing out. God is setting his people in the right places, readying to reveal them at just the right moments. Sometimes we become a little impatient with God. We wonder when God is going to intervene and take action. God sees the end from the beginning. We need to learn to trust that God is moving to ensure all the pieces are in the right place at just the right time. Esther teaches us we have to wait for God's timing. Each young woman's turn came to go in to King Ahasuerus after she had completed. Now take note of this, 12 months preparation according to the regulations for the women. For thus were the days of their preparation apportioned. 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. I've heard some of my male friends complaining about how long their wives take to get ready to go out. But 12 months of beautification, that's outrageous. But secretly, I do have to admit, I would have loved to have seen the before and after pictures. Thus prepared, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shazgaz. For the record, that's my second favourite name in Esther, after Carcass, the deadly fella. Shazgaz, the king's eunuch, who kept the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. At the end of this 12 months, the virgins are subjected to a night with Xerxes. Then the young women would live out a lonely life in the king's harem, only to be disturbed if the king felt a lustful desire for her presence again. This picture, drawn for us, really unveils the depravity of Xerxes. The more I read about him, the less I like him. Now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favour in the sight of all who saw her, just like Joseph, the son of Jacob. Esther requested nothing but what Haggai advised. You see, she's a smart cookie. Xerxes has shown himself to be a man who seeks the opinion of others. No doubt Haggai would tell Xerxes who his favourite was, heavily influencing Xerxes' decision. Rather than lament her dreadful situation, Esther decides to make the best of things. If I'm going to be in Xerxes' harem, I may as well be his queen. She complies with Haggai's every instruction and is clearly now Haggai's favourite and is therefore odds-on favourite for the throne. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, making that now the year 479 BC. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favour in his sight, more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. An obscure orphan girl from a conquered minority group, now queen. Surely a clear demonstration of the hand of God. God now has his key person in a place of great power and her Jewish heritage hidden from the people of consequence. And Xerxes puts on another great feast and not so humbly proclaims his own generosity here at the end of verse 18. When virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai, as when she was brought up by him. Esther to me shows all the signs of a godly woman, listening to her parents even when in a position of power. Here she is respectful and obedient to her father, even though she is now the queen of the most powerful man in the world. By contrast, Xerxes shows that he's a pig. Just after celebrating the crowning of his new queen, what does he do? He puts on a second beauty contest so that he can add further to his harem and extend the misery of still more young women. There are numerous paired events in the story of Esther. In the first chapter, there were the two feasts of Xerxes. Now in this chapter, we have the two beauty contests. Keep an eye out in the future studies for a continuation of this pairing of events. Also notice the minor detail mentioned that Mordecai sat within the king's gate, just mentioned in passing. But this detail suggestive of a place of prominence for Mordecai, the place where magistrates and judges sat. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. We'll conclude our study with this verse, noting now that Esther is the hidden Hebrew queen, and Mordecai seems to have risen to a place of prominence. He's intervened to save the life of Xerxes, yet he's given no reward for his service to the king, which is out of character for the king. For kings understand their best interests are served by rewarding loyalty as much as punishing disloyalty. The unseen, hidden hand of God is moving to ensure no reward at this time was given to Mordecai. God's name is never mentioned, but his presence is surely felt. He's ensuring all the bigger pieces of his plan are in just the right place for the dramatic moment soon to play out. We need to learn from the book of Esther, whose name is a secret code meaning hidden or concealed, that the hidden plans of God are at work in our lives. We need to be godly men and women trusting in our Heavenly Father, living lives of faith, acting in accordance with God's Word, keeping our eyes on an eternal perspective, not being disheartened by temporary discomforts or trials. Then occasionally we're privileged to see glimpses of the bigger plans of God playing out around us. See you in our next study.